To start off with a brief introduction on our guest speaker, Dave Muffly. I'm very excited to have Dave with us here today. A bit of background on Dave. So he was born and raised all the way out in Nebraska, and he came out to California when he got his undergrad in mechanical engineering. So not really that closely related to trees, you could say, but then he had a change of heart and he started volunteering at Stanford to help water and establish oak trees, which ended up in more than 4,000 oaks across the campus by today. From there, he branched out into other projects, such as distributing fruit trees to California school kids in a project called Fruition. He has also partnered with the Palo Alto urban tree nonprofit, Canopy. Some of you may be familiar with that. You might say that Dave is the most well known for his work at Apple Park in Cupertino. He was hired by Steve Jobs to manage the planting and establishment of 9,000 trees across the campus. So with all his work on trees, Dave realized that climate change is just unavoidable. So he started experimenting with new urban tree species to plant. And that is what Dave is here to talk to us about today. He's going to tell us about his work and share his knowledge on climate resilient trees, especially oaks, so that we can plant stronger trees and ensure the future of our urban forests. So without further ado, please give Dave your full attention. Dave, thank you so much for being here today, and please take it away.
Okay, thank you for that great introduction. And I want to apologize. The last time we tried to do this, we had some technical glitches, which we seem to have resolved yesterday. So we're going to try to go right into the presentation.
Okay, I see your screen and I see the QR code in full screen.
Okay, so the QR code is actually for a different, longer presentation. So if you guys want to capture that, I'll show it again at the end. Okay, this is the Apple Park headquarters. Steve Jobs hired me in 2011 to plant 9,000 trees. And you can see here 9,000 trees, 135 taxa, more than 60 kinds of oaks, many of them used by the hundreds, and virtually all of them worked. Next slide. So this is the construction project. We planted everything. We moved 100-foot redwoods. We moved a 60 by 60-foot oak. But the most common size, because I'm not an idiot, is a 24-inch box. But they needed a lot of big trees for the instant effect. So I gave them everything. Next slide. So there's what it looks like. That was Worldwide Developer Conference a couple of years ago, filling in nice. Trees are solid. Next slide. Here you go. It's crazy project. The building looks like a UFO. And Steve Jobs showed me an image what looked like a UFO and told me to plant a forest to land it in. So that's what we did, and the effect is pretty amazing. Next slide. So there they are. People always hang out in the shade. If you haven't noticed it, there's a bunch of developers hanging out in the shade of one of my valley oaks. Next slide. So, and naturally, when you put a bunch of trees into the middle of suburbia, you get wildlife, and they've had ducks, foxes, everything showed up, even though it's 3 miles to the nearest wildland urban interface. The critters are finding it, even though it's in the middle of the valley. Next slide. So there's about the craziest thing I've done. It's 60 by 60-foot oak, 36-inch DBH. Probably cost $250,000 to move. Took 2 cranes to lift. And it was a game for me because I'm the acorn 15-gallon guy from the nonprofit side. And then Steve hired me, and I had to figure out how to move giant trees around. But luckily, he left me with the biggest budget an arborist ever had, and I'm a smart guy. So I figured out how to spend that money and win. Next slide. So here is that tree 5 years later, fully reestablished. It looks better now than before it was transplanted. And that's because I got to move a giant root ball that's normally too expensive for projects. The roots spread wide, and if you don't get enough roots, you can't reestablish. But if you get enough roots and you hit it with enough water, you can reestablish them. Next slide. This is hilarious. We moved redwoods around like Christmas trees. And this was at Christmas. I used as my Christmas card that year. It was nuts. Redwoods are, if you have reservoirs full of water, redwoods are easy to transplant. You just have to throw a ton of water at them and they reestablish instantly. So that was really interesting. Next slide. Next slide. There we go. So this is where I started in 1989. So my mechanical engineering degree is from Stanford. So that was not a trivial exercise, but I didn't like it. And year after I graduated, I came back and I started planting oak trees on the dish at Stanford. So this next slide. So the Dish Open Space, we've established nearly 4,000 trees. An ecological service nonprofit called Magic, who are still good friends of mine. We use tree shelters. We know how to use them. Nobody else, I've never seen anybody else use them right. We've used them like 5,000 times successfully. Next slide.
Wait, can you back? What's a tree shelter?
You'll see more pictures, more details coming. So this is the
questions.
This is the dish at Stanford, just so you can see on the kind of upper right's the main campus. And then there's this 880-acre open space preserve, south-facing slope, cattle grazed, can't grow over there. We interplanted on the green side, the uphill to the right. Next slide. Did it with volunteers, tens of thousands of them. Project really started in the late 70s, and Stanford continues to pay them. And it's what, 40, 45 years later. So I've gotten to watch a planting over decades, which almost nobody in the biz does. Next slide. So there's how we did it. 2 years of bucket watering. And you can see it was pretty fun. That's how I started out with trees, riding on the top of that water truck, carrying 5-gallon buckets during the dry season. So everything got 2 years of bucket watering and then was left to establish itself. And where we planted into good soils, the trees all established. And where we planted into thin grassland soil, we got 30-year-old oaks that are 3 feet tall. They stunt good, but it's not what we were after. So I learned about soils. Next slide. So there's your first view of the tree shelter. And it's simply a tube developed in England. We hold it up with rebar. And then there's an underground cage. A metal cage goes 18 inches above and below because there's ground squirrels everywhere, and they'll kill everything. So next slide. So there's a tree shelter in action with a valley oak. So that's a picture taken a year and a half post acorn. So we see growth 4 to 6 feet when we do it right. So you really want apical dominant trees. Here you see an apical dominant tree just firing out of the tree shelter. So oaks will go into a bush stage. Our wildland oaks will survive as shrubs for like 30 years before they finally get a leader up. Well, we figured out a way to bypass the shrub stage and you can get big oaks fast. Next slide. So there they are, 15 years post acorn, 5-foot tree shelter, 17-foot valley oaks, 2 years of bucket watering. And notice the stems around the shelters we planted right into a mustard stand. because the mustard grows where the soil's good. And once you get an oak established, it drives taproot below the roots of the mustard. And then the oak takes advantage of the good soil and drives the mustard out. This is smart reforestation, which you probably won't ever see anywhere else. So next slide. Same trees 15 years later. Same ones, work great. So you won't find many arborists who can show you trees they planted 30 years later. And those are now 33 and they're solid. So methods work. Next slide. So actually go back a slide. I gotta say something about that before we look at pictures. So the reason I got hired at Apple, because it's really weird, is because the dish at Stanford was Steve Jobs' favorite place to walk. So he watched us plant the entire project without us knowing that friggin' Steve Jobs was watching our every move. And then he told his headhunters to find the guy who did it. And I was the guy who became the certified arborist out of the project. So my connection to Apple Park is because Steve watched me succeed doing this, which, I mean, I didn't expect that to play out, but there you go. You just never know what life's going to deal you. So let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about some practical tree establishment techniques. So this is kind of like establishing a 5 or a 15. And I find people don't understand how to water young trees. So the little red zones, those are the critical zones to get watered. Don't worry about the edge. Everybody tries to water the edge stuff and they let the core dry out. For the first couple of years, almost all your roots are in the core root ball. And these are more or less yearly photos of a tree growing really well. And this is my watering strategy. This is how an arborist does it. You flood water near the basin, and I never worry about the side stubs. That's what all the landscape guys do. And you go back and look at their plantings 30 years later and go back and look at mine. So I wanted to give you guys a little practical tree establishment advice. And if you've got young trees, you're out on a job site, the young trees are failing, the first thing you do is get a soil core and find out if those root balls are dry. Don't worry about the diseases, just go right for the root balls. Because 90% of the time, the problems with young trees in California landscapes is water, either too much or too little. And the visible symptoms of too little and too much are the same. The only way to establish trees consistently is to use a soil probe and look at the soil in the root ball and make sure it's kept moist for 2 to 5 years, depending on planting size. So there you go. Let's go to the next slide. So there you go. Here's another piece of advice. I planted a lot of trees in every season. When I plant in the fall between Halloween and Valentine's Day, I almost never have any trouble. And this is Bay Area. I've done most of my work Bay Areas, so maybe you shifted 2 weeks for SoCal. But if you hit that, and that's when all the native plants drop their seeds. Hint, hint. When you try planting, spring's the worst time to plant. Trees trying to grow roots and tops simultaneously and balancing the moisture is virtually impossible. Plant when the native plants drop their seeds and your survival will skyrocket. Next slide. So this is mid-career. So this is my big project before Apple Park. So this is East Palo Alto. That's a freeway sound wall, 12 foot. Put up in 1992, I think. Hated it when it went up because they took out hundreds of trees to put it up, but I understand why. So 2006, working with nonprofit Canopy. Canopy wanted funding from Cal Fire. You can't get Cal Fire funding in Palo Alto because Palo Alto's got money, but you can get Cal Fire money for East Palo Alto all day long. So Canopy, the rich nonprofit, went to poor East Palo Alto, took me along and said, where do you want trees? And they took us to the 101 sound walls, 6 to 9 foot soil strips, rounded up for, at that point, 15 to 20 years. So that's what they gave me. And I said, cool. Also, 5 different power line configurations. And I optimized a different palette under each power line height. Next slide. So now I'm going to take you through here it is, just so you can see it. On the upper right is actually the San Francisco Bay. So we're right at the edge of bay mud, but the planting itself is on the biggest alluvial fan on the peninsula. Right in the middle runs San Francisco Creek, which is the biggest creek on the peninsula. So it's a big ass alluvial fan, and the trees get huge. So I knew that going in, that even though I had a hell freeway spot, I had some of the prime ag soil under the compaction. And I knew if I could drop roots into the prime ag soil that I'd win. Next slide. So there we go. We planted 950 trees on 2.2 miles of sound wall. And they're in there. We planted 15s, 5s, and we even direct seeded into tree shelters on a freeway sound wall. So they're there. That's 2007, this Google time lapse. Let's go to the next. So there they are, 4 years later. We had an irrigation system, and I watered the crap out of them for the first 2 years, because that's my style. That's what's worked. Water the young trees really thoroughly when they're young, and then start backing off at like year 3. So this is year 4, and this is pretty much the last year that they got irrigation. They may have gotten a couple, like 3 or 4 individual irrigations after this, but not very much. So now watch what happened, because I hit that good soil. Next. So there they go. 2 years later, and they've really started to crank. No irrigation at this point. They're just cranking along, established. Next. Boom. 3 years later, and they're actually getting to be a problem. They're less than 10 years old, and they're big time intruding into the into the traffic lane. So watch what happens. Next slide. So I came by in 2016 and pruned it. I was still out there. This is a nonprofit project. Nobody has any friggin' money. And I was like the rich arborist at Apple who'd show up on the East Palo Alto sound wall in the summer evenings and prune the trees. So I limbed that thing up. We had to get it up above the UPS trucks, of course, and up above the sound wall. But look what happened. If you look close, some weird's going on at the base. Next slide. As soon as I limbed it up, somebody hit it at like 30 miles an hour and girdled 60% of the base. And I thought, damn, that was one of my best trees. But watch what happened next. Totally closed. That's 2020. I looked at it like 4 months ago and forgot to take a picture. It's closed. Tree didn't miss a beat. So next slide. So this is one of the new species. So what I've really done in the industry using Apple Park was that I knew we're planting all the wrong trees pretty much. I'd figured that out before Steve hired me. And I'd started experimenting by 20 years ago with the new trees we need for California. So the one you just watched get hit by a car is the netleaf oak, Quercus rugosa. It's the most common tree in Mexico. Mexico has like 8 times as many oaks as California does. It's a global biodiversity hotspot. And you're going to start seeing many more Mexican oaks popping up. So this is the first one. This one's a little touchy. It doesn't take heat that well. You kind of got to keep it real close to the coast, but it does something crazy. The leaves are hairy on the underside, and it's a dense evergreen, and the leaves filter out tire dust and diesel soot. And I learned that because I went in to prune one that I'd left skirted to the ground. And when I came out, the volunteers gasped because my face was black from climbing into the canopy to do the crown raising. And then we looked at the underside of the leaves, and they're just coated with the bad shit coming off the freeway. So these are really cool air pollution mitigation trees. And I've already presented this to Caltrans. You're going to start seeing more of them, but don't take them too far inland. The heat'll knock them down. But they're great in the near coastal zone. Somewhere like Malibu should have 1 billion of these. Next slide. So that project got famous up in the Bay Area, and somebody in a nonprofit in Oakland called me up. Hey, we want to replicate your sound wall. So I got them all the trees. And so now that planting style is being replicated, which is super fun for me. And that's the big old 880 sound wall. That's like a 25-foot sound wall. That's not screwing around. And that's East Oakland. People are getting murdered within blocks of this planting. So that's what I like. I've done the mega campus, I've done the wildlands, but I've also done the hell spots. And it gives you a lot of insight. So next slide. So I want to show you some techniques. Before we improved the rooting system with the Pioneer air pruning system, I taught volunteers how to rip apart crappy root balls. This is for the sound wall planting. And one of the reasons that planting works so well is because I hand selected each tree, and then you couldn't back then avoid crap roots. So I trained the volunteers um, how to rip root balls apart. So next slide. Somebody actually worked on the sound wall, and let's talk about that at the end. So here I am. You can't have a root twist like that up at the top. It's going to impact the expanding trunk. So you make cuts that big, that close, and then it just spews new roots out of the cut right into the backfill going radially out from the trunk. Hint, hint. Next. So there I am training kids, volunteers, and none of these folks had ever ripped apart root balls. They'd never seen it. The CEO thought we were going to kill them all. Survival rates like still over 80%, like 16 years later. Next slide. So this is right after, there's the freshly planted trees to give you a sense. We had contractors actually put the trees in because it's super dangerous out there. But the vols did like the seed plantings and the mulching and tuning of the irrigation system. Next slide. There we are, a bunch of volunteers, really good work. A lot of people made that possible. Next slide. So we also had to prune them. And unfortunately, drought-tolerant trees often like to grow wide instead of tall. So there was a lot of pruning involved in getting these things up over the sound wall, and we didn't have money for that. So I was doing a lot of it. But there you can see, I kept that's been pruned. You see the 1 liter sticking up? That's my establishment style. I didn't knock down the low stuff. Those are the solar panels driving the growth of the roots in the top. But I took out all the competing leaders and used the cylinder of leaves below to drive that leader up over the sound wall. Next slide. So here's a more extreme form. Stupid coast live oak always wants to grow kind of weepy. And so we actually went out there with bamboo And masking tape. Don't use green nursery tape if you do this because it'll girdle the trees. Use masking tape and bamboo. And as the tree trunk expands, it sheds the bamboo and the masking tape. It automatically comes off. And by then the wood is hard. So we did some pretty hardcore stuff to get the trees over the sound wall. And as you can see, I'm not afraid to tie bamboo directly to trunks, and it works fine. Next slide. So here's another one, kind of showing you my technique. This is that same Quercus rugosa that got hit by the car, but this is like 2010, 15 years ago. So that's what it was looking like. I had to plant a natural and turn it back into a standard, and I did that over a couple years. So look at that picture, get it in your mind. Now switch to the next slide, please. That's all I did in that planting. I just shortened up all the side stuff and left that clean leader to go. Next slide. Death by 1,000 cuts. So those are the pieces that I took off the tree. I didn't do anything big. I did a lot of little things. So if you look in the lower left of the picture, do you see the little spot of red amongst the green foliage? These things put on red and orange new growth. It's beautiful. Best time to prune is when trees have just initiated new growth, because then you can see where the tree wants to grow and you can decide whether you want it to grow there or not. So if you prune right during the flush, at the beginning of a flush, you can redirect the energy of the tree and way speed up establishment by directing the energy of the tree exactly where you want it, and don't let it go anywhere else. Next slide. There you go. Oh, I included a picture. There's the new growth. It just popped. And as soon as I see new growth pop, that's when I go prune trees that I care about. So I'm a spring pruner. And that also is really nice because that's when the wounds heal fastest. The wounds close instantly. Never have disease problem. Pruning California trees in the winter, especially near rain, dumbest thing you can do. It's a great way to send wet fungus right into open wounds. Next slide. There's that net leaf oak all covered in new growth with its big old wound at the base. So it worked. And rugosa is a good tree. It's got a good upright growth habit, and that's what we need more of for our urban forest. No more of these wide spreading trees along rights of way. That doesn't work. We don't have money for pruning ever. So next slide. So here you go. Now I'm going to show you another quick time lapse. Cork oak is the tree that has been ruined by bad roots in our industry. When you fix the roots, cork oak's the best tree you can grow. So in the middle of this picture is a freshly planted 15 cork oak with a really good upright growth habit and good roots that I hand selected. Now go ahead and go through next slide. Watch the center. 2011, 4 years, she's taken off. I've kept the lower tight, let the leader go. Next slide. There it is. 2 years later, that thing's starting to jump. Next slide. There it goes. 3 more years, no irrigation. Cork oak got into that deep alluvial soil, and that's where they want to be. Next slide. There it is. Next year, it took a big leap there. Next slide. 2017, that sound wall hit 117 degrees. We had a heat wave like none other. Cork oak was unfazed by 117. You can grow them in Tucson and Phoenix. We want more of them. There it is in 2020. Next slide. Next slide. So there it is. I love them. Bark's great. Got to kind of keep him out of the way of vandals, but nobody seems to notice him. Next slide. So you notice that is a cork oak next to a coast live oak, and they were planted the same day back in 2007. And you can see how the coast live oak wants to grow. It's like a bad hair day. And pruning that to clearance is a pain in the ass. So you notice the cork oak, you just make a few cuts and she's going to hold that upright branch angle. That upright branch angle is critical because cork oaks actually vary in growth habit. So they'll grow all the way from almost columnar to weeping. You never want to plant pendulous trees next to a clearance zone. Next slide. So, but if you start looking at cork oaks, most of them you see are crap. They're like this. This is Santa Barbara, where I live in a parking lot downtown. That's a cork oak. It's got bottle bud. It's bleeding. It's like, 12 feet tall. Now, why did it do that? Why do the cork oaks always go down? Yeah, look at that. Nice bleeding cankers. It's full of Phytophthora. Next slide. Yeah. Why? Circling and girdling roots. Thick bark blocks root grafting. So where the circled and girdling roots are up against the trunk, it becomes a perfect site to initiate Phytophthora. Duh, duh, duh. Next slide. Same parking lot. This is literally 100 feet away. It's another cork oak, clearly from the same parking lot planting. It's beautiful. It's perfect. Next slide. And there's nothing at the base. That's how random our nursery industry has been historically. And the bad roots have ruined the good trees because good trees in a drought fire zone have thick bark, and thick bark blocks root grafting. So you got to have perfect roots under the drought tolerant trees. Now let's show you how we do that. Next slide. Making the right roots. So if you see Dave Teschler from Devil Mountain Nursery, he presents sometime, go watch him present. He's my buddy, and we did this together. So on the left is a pioneer pot root system of, I'm not sure I think it's podocarpus, and on the right is a coast live oak root system. So on the left is air pruning. So let's show you how it works because it creates a beautiful root system. Next. So 32 count liner, air pruning system. 32 of those are held in a container. Next. There you go. You put an oak in one of those babies and the taproot blows right to the bottom. And it comes out fresh, but it can't survive in the air. Next slide. So there they are, whole tray of them, roots popping out, and you can just see the roots starting to dry out and die. So next slide. But that's just the taproot. So this is what we want to see because a taproot doesn't work in slick wall containers. It just coils. So you have to stop it. So air pruning does that. But when it stops it via pruning, that wakes up the lateral roots along the taproot. Next slide. There they are, the little white roots blowing out the side of the container. Next slide. There's my friend Dave Teschler from Devil Mountain holding up. He loves these things. So we introduced this technique for Apple Park. I made them grow with it. And then the old Valley Crest converted all their internal production within 6 months. We can grow perfect trees 2 to 4 times faster. So all the slick wall pots were just a hideous, hideous mistake. Next slide. So that's what an oak looks like. This is moving them up into a number 5 pioneer. You see, it's another air basket and it's got a socket because you can't expose it directly to the air because then it dries out too fast. And the roots, literally, that's overnight growth of roots. They push an inch overnight and then they dry out during the day and the next night. So they keep getting more and more dense. Next slide. And that's what it looks like. That's a valley oak in a 5 gallon. You won't find that except with a Pioneer system. They're perfect. And these things grow fast when you put them in the ground. So next slide. So you can see they popped one of those beautiful 5s into a 24. And God bless Devil Mountain, they killed one so we could see the roots. This is Compton's oak. You guys probably haven't heard of it. We've used them in limited quantities, but it's a real good rooting oak. But that root system is insane. That's a 24-inch box. And every root is viable. Every root is aimed in the right direction. And we now produce these by the tens of thousands, even though almost nobody knows about them. Next slide. And the way we make those is that I go collect acorns, and so do a few others. So next slide. So that is Quercus tomentella, the island oak, the rarest of all California oaks. And those things are catching on as street trees, and that's like 3,000 of them. They're selling out every crop that Devil Mountain can grow. It's a native tree that actually has an upright growth habit and is easy to prune and doesn't make a billion acorns. So next slide. We'll show you more in a second. There it is, California mainland champion island oak, Santa Barbara Botanical Garden, 70 by 60 after 60 years but it's ideal growing conditions. Next slide. So there's the leaves. You're going to start seeing these, if you aren't already, as street trees. They're catching on quick. Next slide. There's the catkins. That's up in Davis, UC Davis. There's one. They don't love super hot conditions. They're, again, a little better closer to the coast, but they can go a little ways inland, especially in good soils. Next. So there's one. That's Goleta Water Department, if you're ever on Patterson and Goleta. It's funny, I'll tell you a story. I took this picture 2006, and it's a triple trunk, and I was kind of worried about that back then, and it's in a lawn. So I watched something interesting happen. They took the lawn off of it, and for about 2011 and 2012, and then I bought a house in Santa Barbara, so I've been monitoring it. So after they took the lawn away, the tree went through about a 3-year decline. And then it started doing better. And now it looks fine with the lawn gone. So what it appears to have done is that it sent new roots down into the deep ag soils there. So that was really interesting. They're tough trees. Next slide. So there's another island oak, but this out in San Ynez, out in the San Ynez Valley with the grapes around them. It gets hot as heck out there. But again, good ag soil, perfect tree. Look at that. It's an easy to grow native oak that designers love. Next up. So here's some. These are just young ones near me in Santa Barbara. So you can see what they look like. They need a bit of pruning when they're young, but once you get them set up, they're good. Next slide. So there they are. That was first commercial set. That was the set that I had them grow for Apple Park. Those are the first ones grown with air pruning roots. First commercial set. They've got, I think, 8,000 in production now, less than a decade later. Next. So now, Coast Live Oak. Coast Live Oak's in trouble. Don't expect Coast Live Oaks to survive. You're going to see more and more trouble. They're not going to be up for climate change. We're seeing the preview down in San Diego County where they're dying. So in this picture on the left is an Engelmann oak. On the right is a Coast Live Oak. Coast Live Oaks are all dead. So next slide. So that's Engelmann Oak Woodland down in eastern San Diego County around San Isabel. So you've also got Engelmann's right in Arcadia, Pasadena. Next slide. So there's a beauty. So once I found the right mama trees, Engelmann Oak has a really good upright growth habit. You're looking at a 250-year-old tree there in the San Isabel Nature Preserve, which is like the best place to see these trees in the state. So next slide. There's the foliage, gorgeous blue foliage. People love them. So it's a really nice tree. It's real clean. It isn't a huge acorn producer like Coast Live Oak, which makes it a much better urban tree. And the blue color is real nice. Next slide. There's one. That's Arcadia right on Colorado. And that tree's old. I don't know whether they planted it next to the mortuary or whether they built the mortuary around it. Next slide. But it's surviving hardcore urban conditions, including lawns, sidewalks, and that's old pavement next to the trunk. That's not uplift. So these guys go deep. Yep, that's okay. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is a street of Engelmann Oaks, but it's in Australia. You can't find it in California, but the Australians did it 50 years ago, and they're really nice street trees. Next slide. So I planted the first one that anybody knows of in the Bay Area at Stanford, and there she is. 45 by 25, 20 years, grown from an acorn I collected at UC Davis in 2003. 2 years dry season volunteer irrigation, but really good soils, and there is a drainage swale nearby. So it's really good. It's some of the best quality unirrigated conditions you're going to find. But Stanford's planting these everywhere. After I made their designers aware, they're just putting Engelmann Oak everywhere on the campus now. I love it. Next slide. So here, I'm going to give you a tree shelter sequence. So this is that Engelmann Oak. So planted as a seedling and it took off. So you can see it's got a nice upright growth habit, blew right out of the tree shelter, got a nice little set of lateral roots to protect the trunk. And you can see one detail I want to point out at the top of the tree shelter. You've got some skewers, and that's because birds will fly down the tree shelters when the trees are young, and they'll die. So you got to keep the birds out, but let the trees escape. Next slide. So there it is, taken off. We've cut the tree shelter down, but the mower guys will run into the trunk, so you keep that low protection on as long as you can. Next slide. There she is, going nicely, shelter's off. See how dry it is? Next slide. Coming along, next slide. Okay, there she is, really turning into a tree. So Engelmann Oak's a big favorite. Next slide. Yep, and there's that final picture. There you go, next slide. So that's how Devil Mountain grows them. I figured out where the mama trees are. I go in and I collect the acorns because it matters what mama trees you collect from. And I've got the eye. So I actually collect the acorns. I was just in Arizona 6 weeks ago collecting Quercus hypoleucoides, collected 9,000 acorns out of the wild. Next slide. So there's those Engelmann Oaks coming up in those pioneers looking awesome. Next slide. There's seedling, some of the nicest seedlings I've ever seen. Next slide. And there they are. That's Devil Mountain Nursery. They've got this stuff in production in quantity. They also, unfortunately, they broker in bad quality trees, and you actually have to go select at the nursery to make sure you get good stuff, which is a pain. I look forward to fixing that, but at least they've got them and we've got it started. And almost all the cool oak species are being grown with good roots. Next slide. So, searching for climate adapted trees outside California. So, I went looking for climates that are already have the climates that we are predicted to have with climate change. And it turns out that northwestern Mexico and the mountains of the American Southwest are really good approximations of future climate in coastal California. Next slide. So this is Mount Lemmon above Tucson. Tucson's 3,000 feet. There's a mountain that goes to 9,500 feet beside Tucson in the Catalina Range called Mount Lemmon. And you get 11 inches of rainfall average at the base. And at the top of the mountain, the average is 29 inches. So as you go from about 4,000 feet to the top, you go through a dozen different oak species, which are all monsoonal adapted. And I began trying these species, and it turns out they really like coastal California. Next slide. So that is the silverleaf oak, Quercus hypolicoides, Catalina Highway, Mount Lemmon above Tucson. Beautiful little trees that look like olives. Next. So this is what I was telling you about. You can look at this some other time, but this shows elevation and rainfall on Mount Lemmon. And the different rainfall levels at the different elevation support different oak trees. And the rainfall levels match coastal California pretty much perfectly. So and the temperature range isn't very far off. So that's how I've been able to bring in new trees and have them work right off the bat because I match the climate zones. Next slide. So there's a nice silverleaf. That's a bigger one. They grow all up and down the mountains, all different rainfall levels. They're the most common tree. It's already evolved, works great for us. And they look like olive trees, but they grow upright. They aren't a pain in the butt like olives, always weeping into the clearance zones. Next slide. So here's some more. The reason it's cool is it's not that big an oak. It's moderate size. We can actually use it in the cities without causing big heartaches. So here you see it growing. This is Madera Canyon. And Madera Canyon probably gets, I don't know, they're probably about the 18-inch a year level average. So like a kind of a moist spot in coastal California. So doing beautiful. Hold clearances nicely, and everybody loves these things because they look like olive trees. Next slide. There you go. That's the leaf underside, whitish silver. Next side. And there's one. I learned the tree actually, Hoyt Arboretum in Portland. My friend Sean Hogan got one planted clear back like 1995. So here it is. I took this picture in 2009. Now watch the time lapse. Next. So there it is. You have to look in the middle. There's a ginkgo on the right, and it's the dark one in the middle. Next slide. So there it is, catching up to the ginkgo right over top of the white car. Next slide. There it is. Put on a good growth there. Next slide. And there she is, looking beautiful. People in the shade. 25-year-old tree up to like 40 feet. Really nice dappled shade. It's a winner. Next slide. So I'm going to show you one more. We're almost at the end. So Hypolicoides, good tree. This thing it's a hybrid of southern live oak and escarpment oak. And there is now a form available in the nursery called the Joan Lionetti live oak. And it's Quercus virginiana ex fusiformis, closer to fusiformis, which is the oak from the hell of West Texas. So this picture is a street tree unirrigated in Tucson. That's Pima Road in Tucson. That thing's taken 120 degrees without any irrigation. And there's a bunch of them. We want to plant these. These are a really good climate change tree for us. And I think you're going to start seeing a lot of them because they're also upright growth habit. They don't make a ton of acorns. Next slide. And there's one pretty beautiful tree. The designers like it. It's tough as nails, takes water, takes dry. It's what we need. Next slide. And one last one, we're trying to bring back the small eucalyptus, the best of the eucalypts. We threw away a whole genus with 500 species because we chose to plant the wrong ones in the first round. Well, we did some experimental ones, and I work with Matt Ritter out of Cal Poly, and we're starting to introduce the really cool small ones and some of the better big ones. Because, man, climate change is going to be nasty, and the ukes can handle nasty better than my oaks can. So the oak guy, when things get rough, gets forced to go to eucalyptus. So there you go. And let's just go to the next slide. There you go. You can see it. I knew the tree before I knew its name. I'd bicycled under it for 20 years. Really good little tree. I always loved it. Next size. And there's one as a street tree, just so you can see that. And next slide. And there it is. It's really nice when they got good roots. Again, eucalyptus with good roots, a way better tree than eucalyptus with compromised slick wall roots. Next slide. And that is the end. That's me. My website is oaktopia.org. It's a little old and a little chaotic, but there's a lot of info. And I was inducted into the California Landscape Hall of Fame last year, Lifetime Achievement Award. So I like to share that. And thank you guys for listening. And thank you for handling my technical glitch so nicely.
Of course, it was a real pleasure, Dave. I thoroughly enjoyed your talk. It was very informative and very entertaining. And congratulations on your award.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, go
Dave,
ahead.
where can we find this pioneer system? Personally, I'm growing a few jacarandas, obviously tropical trees, some avocados, and I'm really interested in substituting to that pioneer system. Is it available anywhere online?
So the company is Blackmore, but I'm gonna tell you something that's it's really a commercial system. You've got to be on, there is no slack in the watering because they dry out, and they dry out much more rapidly than normal slick walls. So unless you are on it like a hawk, I tried distributing them last year to a couple nonprofit plantings. They killed them all because they refused to water them as often as I told them to. And they just dried them out. And it's like, no, no, no. So you got to be careful. These are really, I've learned the hard way that these are best used in commercial settings. And frankly, when I tell nonprofits to grow trees, I just use deep pots. I use Stewie and Son deep pots. I use 4x4x14. I use deep pot slick walls for a small scale grow, just letting those work nearly as well.
Okay.
So I have to give that warning because I got burned hard because they all wanted to blame me after I had told them that they dry out vastly faster.
Right.
So,
Great.
and yeah, so keep your eyes open. and you can look at Stewie and Sons. The deep pots, we've also grown a lot of good oaks in deep pots, 4 by 4 by 14 and bigger. So anything that allows the roots to go down and doesn't make them go in circles is an
Awesome.
improvement.
Thank you so much for the information.
Yeah.
Hey, Dave, this is Sarah. I just wanted to say thank you so much for an awesome talk. It was really engaging and educational throughout. And you mentioned that you have to go to the nursery and pick out your own stock because it's all mixed in good and bad. So there's two questions. Is the Pioneer system only specifically from the acorns you're bringing in and they're not doing it with any of the other trees?
So here's the deal. Devil Mountain grows half of their stuff and they broker the other half. And they don't tell anyone which they're doing. So yeah, you kind of I always tag for clients. That's what Steve Jobs hired me to do. That's what I've been doing for years, and I still do it until we have the industry fixed, which I don't know if it'll happen. Then I make sure, but also their head horticulturist is my best friend. So often I just call him up and say, Dave, will you throw some tags on the good ones? And in
Must be
fact,
nice. Yeah, ahead.
my friend Dave Teschler is texting me right now.
Yeah, we're
He
gonna
just-
want it. Well, you're gonna want him next.
Yeah.
Because
No.
we buy from Devil Mountain almost exclusively, unless we can't find it there.
Yeah. No, but get in contact with Dave. He's as good or even better than I am. He's different. He's really engaging. So you get a different
Yeah.
perspective, but
I've met him
very
at a conference before. Yeah.
okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I would love if you could connect us.
And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
how
Sorry
for
to butt in.
us, so for us, what's the easiest way to know between good and bad roots without taking it out of the bucket? Is there a way to do that? Are you just looking for girdled roots on the surface?
Oh, you want to know how I do it? So I have an archaeologist tool. Can't remember where I got it, but it's the thing the archaeologists use to dig in the rocks. So I go into those root balls from the top. I don't pull them. But if they're bad enough, I'll go down 6 inches with my tool and tease it apart. I go to the edge, but I haven't done that for ages because the Pioneer pot system fixed it. The only time I bust out my archaeologist hammer is when somebody wants a really big tree and I have to go into the box and make sure that it doesn't have a core strangler on it. So, but yeah, really, I don't touch the old style stock anymore for my projects. I'd rather direct seed. I'm really good at direct seeding because I don't know anybody who knows how to use tree shelters. We've been doing it successfully for 35 years. And I go to everybody else's project and they yank the tubexes right off the first year, and then the trees fall over and get eaten by predators. They can't figure out how to use them. So, yeah, but you can always, so the real trick is order early. And they're often sold out of the good stuff by, say, November. So the way there's two ways to ensure you get the right stuff. One of them, move your plantings to the proper season. So you're not doing off-season plantings. Do it right in the core of the planting season and get your trees locked into contract like at the end of the summer, like about now. And go out, send somebody out, throw some tags on, talk to Dave directly. See, there's all kinds of special treatment that's available if you know the right people. Because once you know Dave, you'll just be able to call him up and he'll just guide you right to the stuff you need. So once you know the right people within the system, it's easy.
Mm.
And if you and Dave and I love you guys who plant our stuff. I just love seeing trees that I introduced to the nursery industry randomly on the streets around me and thriving. That's like, I don't have kids. I don't have family. I got trees, man. So I love seeing more of my trees.
I love it. That's great advice to get on contract and have just a full planting season.
And Devil Mountain,
that's a good idea.
Devil Mountain is in recent years has made it easier to contract grow. They've changed in part at my insistence. So I think if you prod your salespeople a little bit, that yeah, you can end up in a good place. But get on it early, because Dave's sending me the picture of the prime 15s in the nurseries, and people are going to start buying them soon.
Dave, this is Steve. I have a question. What's your recommendation for plant? You get this beautiful root system that's been grown by Devil Mountain, and then you get it out into the field, and I've got my planters that are going to plant the tree, and you know, typically the hole is 2 times wider than the depth, and is that still your philosophy? And then they're going to cram this beautiful root system in this shallow hole to keep the root ball where it needs to be. I mean, is there recommendations there when we get them out into the field?
So now I'll tell you my secret. There are many places that I will not be involved in planting a tree, period. So a lot of people plant trees in places that I know they're going to fail. So what I do, I don't worry about a planting hole very much, because all I care about is the deep soil. I'm the guy who doesn't give a shit about that surface 3 feet that everybody else is concerned about. I'm dropping tap roots into alluvial fans that have groundwater. That's how you win. Go talk to an avocado farmer. Go talk to a human being who earns their livelihood growing trees, and their techniques will have nothing in common with what our landscape industry does. So the first thing, the other tool that I have, I've told you, I have 3 tools. I have a soil corer. I do not use a moisture indicator. Electronic moisture indicators change with soil type, and in an urban area, your soil type changes continuously. Electronic moisture meters are a waste of time. You got to have a soil corer, tool 1. Tool 2 is my archaeologist hammer that I tear root balls apart with if I need to. Tool number 3, hey, wait, show and tell. See this? Anybody know what this is? Tile probe. Tile probe will tell you what your soil compaction is. It's a weird trick that I learned from the landscape architects who did the Pixar campus. If you can put a tile probe, cheap metal, steel, 3.5-foot tile probe through dry soil or wet, that means its compaction is 85% or below. Root growth stops at 86%. So before I'll plant anywhere, I don't care about the side. I make sure that the bottom drains, and ideally down 3 or 4 feet. And that's why I do all my watering in the initial stages near the trunk. I have a completely different tree establishment strategy that is utilized by the industry. And like I say, I look at soils maps. I know how to read soils maps. If you know David Kelly is the top soils guy in California. He was my partner on Apple Park. He advises all the big projects, all the big orchards. And what I'm teaching you are orchard techniques that the old timers knew that our industry has abandoned. So yeah, I don't worry. I'm always looking for the deep holes. I'm looking for the deep soils to put my trees into.
Yeah, I figured you did something different. That's why I asked.
But it works. I've done it 10.
Yes,
I've done it 10,000 times at this point, and all the people who say the other techniques work, I learned my techniques figuring out why all their plantings failed. Yeah, I've been looking at parking lots and streets for almost 40 years with the mind of a Stanford trained mechanical engineer. everybody who failed became fodder in my learning. So you kind of figure a Steve Jobs guy is going to be kind of different, a little intense, but also very successful. So yeah, it's a little different. Look for the deep
All you
soils.
kids out there, stay in
What's
school. I said, for
that?
all you kids out there, stay in school. Well, look, great stuff. I'm responsible for the production for A Plus Tree, and we really appreciate you taking time. You're very engaging, and it's exciting to see success with individuals and the passion. The passion is that's what really gets me going and ignited. So I really appreciate the talk. It was great, and thanks. Yeah, put it on.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. As you can tell, I love doing this. I was born to educate, and I've like stumbled into some really powerful techniques. So yeah, the passion is real because I like telling you guys about it. You got taught too many bad ideas. I want to fix some of that.
Yes, I love hearing you talk, Dave.
Tile,
Question on
yes,
your
tile, exactly. Tile probe. That's what this thing's called. And you can just carry it around with you. And sometimes, let me tell you guys one more trick since I haven't lost you yet. So, oft times, like I'm doing Thousand Oaks Boulevard now. I'm under contract with City of Thousand Oaks. I just wrote the tree report for Thousand Oak Boulevard. And I know the surface of those things. We're going to take out a bunch of trees, but we're going to put in hundreds of these cool oaks. And I know the surface is a mess. There's compaction, often on old agricultural soils in California. And we built most of our cities right on top of agricultural zones. The compaction layers are only in the surface. They're only 1 to maybe 3 feet deep. And often, once you can blow through that compaction layer, the roots go deep. They know what to do. So sometimes you like have to dig a test hole that goes down deep enough that you can prove that your probe will go to those deeper levels. And anytime you guys see an open, deep hole in urban soils that you can read the side profiles, go look at them. Go in and feel around. That was a trick that David Kelly taught me. The topsoils guy is always looking for holes that people are digging and going in and looking at the layers and learn what the stuff feels like yourself, and then triangulate it with the tile probe because the soils are way more critical than anybody ever taught you. So there, I'll shut up now.
Dave, what exactly is your watering routine for newly planted trees? Like, I know you mentioned, the hand watering during the dry season. What's like the frequency, amount? Does it vary from species to species?
Not much variation by species, some variation by planting size. So what I like to do is plant in that Halloween to Valentine's window. And when I plant, if it's not already saturated ground, I water I'll put 100 gallons on a seedling because I want it to have ideal conditions during the winter. See, our winters are unusual by comparison to the rest of the nation because the ground doesn't freeze. Our roots grow all winter long because our soils are warm. So you want to make sure during the winter they have optimized moisture. So then I'll watch them. It kind of depends. Once the rains taper down, a couple weeks after the rains taper down, depending on temperatures, that's when I'll start watering. And there's no fixed date. It's rain and temperature dependent. So I watch them. And what everything I did is based on those direct seeding that we did, back in the 80s and 90s. Those trees got 5 gallons every 2 weeks Pretty much in any week where the ground wasn't saturated. So if it was a really dry winter, we might do our first watering in March. And if it was a really late one, we might do our first watering in June. And then we'd keep up. If it's a 15-gallon tree, I tend to water the first, well, on the sound wall, when I had to make sure that 815 survived, the first summer I was watering them every 4 to 5 days because I had really good soil drainage. And also, your watering is going to vary based on your soil drainage. If you've got a bad draining hole, the water is going to stick around. And if you start watering it too frequently, you'll waterlog it and kill it. So there are a bunch of invisible variables. And that's why I tell everybody to get a soil core. Hang on. Got to do a show and tell again. This little guy. This is the tool that you see me with all the time. Because once I figured, when I started my arborist business, certified arborist about 2005, I was advising on small tree establishment, but I wasn't getting good results. I was trying to do it visually based on the look of the leaf, but overwatering and underwatering caused the same plant symptom. So the only way to know what's going on is to look. And I've watched a lot of people waterlogged trees that were wilted. Yeah, because they didn't use one of these. So this is the key. And nature doesn't have rules of thumb. People like to create them, but they're usually wrong. You got to learn to talk to mama. She's the one. That's the way I did it. I abandoned my last mentor 20 years ago because he gave me bad information. And since then, it's been me and mama. Steve Jobs visited for a little while and a couple other people showed up. But yeah, everything's different. Haven't you noticed that when you train in certified arborist, everything you see in the field is not in the textbook? Everything is different? Yeah. Same thing applies when you're planting trees. So just keep your wits about you, keep sensing things, use some tools, get some information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And observe. The real key to my success is, well, I have a photographic memory, so I cheat. But it's all about observation. Mama doesn't talk to you. You have to watch. So start observing things and keep observing them for years. And that's when you start to learn the real subtle things. So.
Yes, absolutely. Great advice. Any other questions for
I got one question here. So great presentation, super informative. I absolutely loved it. Do you have any recommendations for the Pacific Northwest as far as climate-ready oak species?
Well, interestingly, for Pacific Northwest, you can go to Sistis Nursery in Portland. That's where Sean Hogan is. He's got a lot of them. But that Hypoleucoides, that was from Portland.
Yeah, I saw that. That was exciting.
They're selling them by the hundreds up into Portland, up into Oregon. Oh, cool. So a lot of this stuff, Oregon's climate isn't that different, especially once you get coastal. So I haven't spent a lot of time, but I talked to people in Portland and they're using a lot of the same trees successfully. Oh, that's right. A guy in the Willamette Valley just this week sent me pictures. He had Quercus arizonica, he had Engelmannii. They were thriving in the Willamette Valley. No, it's surprised. I think you're going to be surprised how similar it turns out to be.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, shall we move on to our Fridays, everybody?
Yeah. Yeah, well, it was a great presentation, Dave. I think everyone thoroughly enjoyed it. Yeah, I will follow up with you, Dave. We have a thank you present we like to send out to presenters, and I'd love to get some more information with all the nurseries and get us, connected, because we like to start getting trees from them and for all the different areas as well. So we're all along Washington, Oregon, California, Utah. But yeah, thank you everyone so much. Thank you for spending your Friday morning with us. I hope you have a good rest of the day. Drive safe wherever you are. And I will see you guys on the next one. And thank you, Dave.
So much.